First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to decide which balls need squashing and stretching. Bowling ball will not squash and stretch when it hits the ground because it is very hard and it doesn't really change its shape. Even if it does, that happens in a very micro level and we are unable to see it bare eyes. And our ping pong ball probably is not going to show a lot of squash and stretch, so we don't need to worry about that as well. I'm going to make our rubber ball squash when it hits the ground, and right after it hits the ground it's going to have a reverse spring motion, so it's going to stretch for a little period of time and then it's going to come back to its rest position. I want to give some squash with the tomato too because it's very soft and mushy, and when we drop a tomato from this high probably it's going to have some squash, but I doubt that it's going to have some stretch, so we're going to try to keep it as natural as we can. So I'm not going to give a stretch to the tomato as I will to the rubber ball. Let's start with the rubber ball and try to understand how this works. I'm going to minimize the other layers that I don't need. I'm going to turn the visibility off for these layers as well. I'm going to come to the first point in time where my ball hits the ground, and I'm going to make it come down a little first. So I'm going to select my layer and use my arrow keys, and maybe press shift, hold, and use my arrow keys to jump 10 pixels at a time. And then I'm going to reveal its scale properties by pressing shift and S, so I can see position values and reveal the scale property at the same time. And I'm going to, this was linked, and I'm going to unlink these two axes, and I'm going to put a keyframe right here. I'm gonna go one frame before, and to do that the shortcut is page up, and if you press page down it's gonna go forward one frame, and if you want to jump 10 frames at a time you can hold shift key and use page up and down keys. So I'm gonna press page up, go one frame before, and put another scale key here, and I'm not gonna change the value, it's gonna be the same. And I'm gonna press page down and come to this impact point. Okay, my ball needs to squash when it hits the ground, but the most important thing that we need to keep in mind while we are doing squash and stretch is that our objects and our characters need to retain their volumes. We cannot make them change their volumes throughout the time because otherwise they won't be recognizable throughout our scenes or throughout our movies. So we cannot, change the proportions of our characters or of our props, and we always need to retain their volumes at all times. Okay, first I'm going to change my X value. It's 10% right now. I'm going to make it 15. So I added 5%, so I'm going to subtract 5% from my Y value. And I'm trying to keep my volumes the same here by doing this. I'm going to bring this ball down a little more so that it sits on the ground better. I'm going to go to the next frame, and this time it's going to have like a reverse spring motion. So the X value is going to drop and it's going to lose some of its power. So I'm not going to use 5% to 15% again, but I'm thinking maybe 8% to 12%, and that's my stretch point. And after 2 frames I'm going to make the values come back to their rest position. Okay, let's check that out. I'm going to make my timeline shorter. I think our first squash and stretch looks pretty good. and you can see the effect that it's making our jump more natural. And I'm going to repeat that, but I'm going to change the values each time so it loses its power. I'm just selecting all these keyframes. I'm Ctrl C, Ctrl V, pasting them and placing them properly. Okay, now I'm going to use 13% to 7%. I'm going to make my ball come down a little. Okay. And for the stretch, 11 to 9%. I'm going to copy these keyframes, come to my next bounce, arrange them, and this time it's just going to have, let's say, 12% to 8%. And it's not going to stretch this time. It's just going to come back to its rest position right after the impact. So I don't need this last keyframe. I'm just going to delete it. And the rest of the jumps are lower, so there's not much impact. So the squash and stretch may not be very visible. I mean, I'm just three first squash and stretches are fine enough for me. If you want, you can increase the squash and stretch. Just try to make sure that they progress from a maximum to a minimum value in a linear or cubic fashion. Okay, let's watch our animation. Great, I'm happy with the results. I think it added more natural movement to our animation. The last thing I want to show you in this part, I'm going to turn on the motion blur for our object. And motion blur is very helpful to get rid of the strobing in our scenes when objects are moving really fast. If they were being filmed with the camera, we were going to see blurry images. When we're shooting with a camera, motion blur is recorded naturally. But when we're doing animation, we need to add that function in our software as an extra process. And it's going to increase our render times, but it's going to make the motions look a lot smoother and pleasant. And to turn on the motion blur, we need to do that on two levels. One of them is the global level. If I turn the motion blur with this icon here, it's going to turn on the motion blur at a global level. And then I need to turn on the motion blur at each layer that I wanted. So every layer has a motion blur option here, right under this box. And they have the same icons. So I want to turn the motion blur on for my rubber ball. I do that. And now when I play back my animation, I'm going to start seeing the motion blur effects. You can see that it's rendering slower now because of the motion blur. But the animation looks a lot smoother. And we can see the effect actually when we just stop at a fast frame. Okay, next part we're going to start squashing our tomato.